Welcome to this edition of Rattling the Bars. Master Boots, co-host with Eddie Conway. To update you on Eddie Conway is doing great. And at some point in time, it's my prayer that Eddie Conway will make a cameo appearance on Rattling the Bars and the Real News programs that he created and that he loved. When we think about the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration, we oftentimes think about the prison landscape being major institutions that house 200,000 people throughout the state, or some institutions housing 1,500, some institutions housing 2,000 or more people. But recently, the Vera Institute did a study on how the county jails and county detention centers are now taking over the landscape of the prison industrial complex. And they're primarily in rural America. This was startling for me because when I look at rural America and I look at the county detention centers, it's oftentimes the county detention center is a reflection of what is going on in the county. So when you have a small county, it would stand to reason that the county jail would not be that populated. Here to talk about this report and some of the ramifications of this study are Steve Janis and Taya Graham. Welcome to Rattling the Bars.
Oh, thanks for having us. We
Thank you
appreciate
so much for
it.
having us.
We're glad to be here.
Okay, and let's start with y'all understanding of this report in terms of, and juxtapose if you can against when you look at the prison industrial complex.
Sure.
How this fits into that narrative. We can start with you, Janice.
Okay, well, one of the things, because both Tay and I started reporting here in Baltimore, and one of the things you think about as a city reporter is that all of the growth in prisons has occurred in cities. But the Vera Institute report points out that that's not true, that the biggest growth of institutions and incarceration is in rural communities, a lot of it driven by the fact that small rural communities will open jails or prisons, there's a distinction there, and then take prisoners and people, immigrants and other things from the federal government or from the state government and charge them for it and turn it kind of into a business. Now, we've gone beyond that report in the sense of our reporting, and Taya can talk about this, because we have a show called the Police Accountability Report, and we report about policing across the country, and we've encountered actually the consequences of this policy, right? This policy of growing prisons in rural communities. And of course, there's a long history of prisons being located in rural communities, but these are actually prisons run by the local governments. And Tay and I have talked to a lot of people and encountered sort of a growing phenomena, which is people ending up in jails and people ending up in confrontations with cops that seem really minor comparatively. And we were kind of looking for a reason. Why do we keep having these cases? And why did people keep calling us? And part of the reason is, I think, what the Vera Institute points out, that there has been a much stronger growth of facilities in small rural communities, and much of it, like the state-run institutions, much of it having to do with states trying to say, look, we're dropping, we're actually shrinking our incarceration rate, and then they just contract it out to the counties. But Taya can talk a little bit about some of the things we've encountered and some of the stories.
So one of the things I just want to add to what Stephen said is that he brought up something that I'll summarize like that. If you build it, they will come.
That's right.
And that's what's happening here. And I think one of the reasons why these jails and prisons are being built is that it's a form of making money for these communities. A lot of these communities have suffered deindustrialization. They've lost their coal mining jobs. They've lost their factories. The jobs that used to be there are gone. So one source of employment for people is to hire them as corrections officers, is to enhance and expand their criminal justice system so that's a way to actually employ people. And then, of course, the labor of the people who are incarcerated is monetized as well. And so they build it, and now they've got to fill these jails. They've got to put bodies in these beds. And that's why we saw this sort of explosion of people being arrested in these small towns for apparently really small crimes, stunningly small. It actually reminded me of zero tolerance here in Baltimore City.
Well, let me add one thing to that when we cover rural communities across this country, one phenomena we notice that is extremely consistent is that in those small communities, if you look at the budgets of the towns, I can point to towns like Milton, West Virginia, or Pocomoke City or Greensboro, and we'll talk about those cities more specifically as we progress. But what you see is that the police department is the number one most well-funded agency by
Absolutely.
30, 40, 50% of the town's budget. Well, what does a police department do? A police department arrests people and incarcerates people. So it's like, I'm not sure if there's a chicken and the egg argument here, but the point is that these communities have invested overwhelmingly in law enforcement rather than social programs or things that will help people. In Milton, West Virginia, and we'll get into that, but West Virginia, we've seen this quite consistently, a state that has suffered because of opioid companies just dump pills and created addicts. Well, how did they respond? They bolstered their police departments, and commensurate with those police departments are prison facilities. So it's all kind of like a political economy that's been created there.
And when I was looking at the Vera report said that they noted there was two reasons why this growth took place. It was one was I think they said that the growth in as far as the bail, the lack of bail reform, right? One is the outsourcing the jail. Going back to your point, the outsourcing the sales to different counties or different states, right? And the population is growing as a result of that. But here, another part of the Vera report, maybe both of y'all can speak on this. Another part of the Vera report spoke about that the reason behind this was policy and practice. That the policy changed and therefore the practice changed. Now, in understanding the legislative aspect of this argument, you have like most counties would have to take, and most states would have to take and change the laws to say that people coming into these county jails would have to be, at one point in time, if you went to a county jail, you was a resident of that county. You committed a crime in that county. Like, and I came through Upper Marlboro. I committed a crime in Prince George's County. So I went to Upper Marlboro Detention Center. That was a county jail. But now, according to the Bill report, I could commit a crime in Mississippi and wind up in a county jail in West Virginia because of the change in the policies and the practice. Can y'all speak on that?
Yeah.
In terms of the laws and how this, because it's almost premeditated.
Well, I think it hits upon this idea that we see over and over again in our reporting, which is that law enforcement is first a business, and not really a public safety institution in many cases, because what this allows all these states to do is operate not just as a business but a PR front. In other words, they can say, we've reduced state incarceration. Look, the state prisons don't have as much, but we're just kind of shoveling people over here, and so it gives them a way to say there's fewer prisoners on our books, and we're paying communities, and it gives the communities that are willing to host these prisons and build these facilities, which is amazing if you look at some of the examples in the report of small communities with very little money building these facilities to then monetize the people, and so it's like a monetization of people, and it's again what you see is an incentivizing of law enforcement and making law enforcement a profit center for these communities, because they really, as Taya pointed out, don't have a lot of sort of institutional, like even in a city like Baltimore, we have Johns Hopkins, we have some things that drive growth, but in many of these rural communities, they really don't have like the manufacturing jobs, and when they leave, I think they look to and turn to this, and this is a way of using the law to make this sound like a good thing, and when it's really not.
And I just wanted to add to that, he said using the law to make it look like it's a good thing when it's actually not. I just want to underscore the hypocrisy that is shown through this type of legislation. When they make the argument that these centers, that these correctional institutions are actually for rehabilitation, how can you convince me that's for rehabilitation when you rip someone away from their community, from their family, when a family member has to drive hours and hours and hours to be able to visit? I just can't believe that this is really, the goal is rehabilitation. I think it shows that there's really a profit motive that's underlying this, and that it's not about truly helping the community. It's about helping that particular area, that county profit.
And I want to beat this point. When you think about, to make sure everybody understands the argument, that when you think about a county jail, or when you think about a detention center, the first thing that you have to come understand is that the person is innocent until proven guilty.
Exactly.
So they're there. They're
Absolutely.
not there. They haven't got no time. They haven't been convicted of no crime. When you send to a state institution or state facility, you're actually serving time. So now,
Yeah.
so how ominous this is in regard to what's being done, you're actually taking a system and saying that we're gonna monetize human trafficking, or we're gonna monetize the slave labor, or we're gonna monetize this chattel, these people,
Right.
by building these units, and then going back to your point there, the law enforcement, like black codes back in slavery time, black laws or Jim Crow, then you find yourself, if you in a county, you're gonna be locked up, but somebody gotta fill themselves up. So how do you, and maybe y'all can answer, how do you get people in themselves? How do you build them? Like you said, if you build them, they will come. Well, if you build them, where you gonna get them from? That means that you have to go get them. So maybe y'all want to address that.
Well, I was just going to mention that something that we've seen in some of the small towns we've covered. And when we say small towns, we mean towns of less than 3,000 people that have police departments with budgets, over 1.2 million, towns that normally have 30 or 40 crimes a year, but yet they have a police department with a budget of over $1 million.
Yeah.
So you can see where they're investing their money. And then they have, of course, these detention centers, these jails, as well as, the larger centers for, longer sentences. And when you see it, to me, it just makes it obvious where you plant your seed, that's where you're going to get the growth. If you keep on putting the community's money into law enforcement and into the prison industrial complex, you can't be surprised when that's what blooms and the rest of your community suffers. And what we've seen in small towns, like, for example, in Milton, West Virginia, which, like I said, has less than 2,500 people in it, that area, their police officers are actually arresting people for tiny traffic infractions, not rolling through a stop sign, not having a turn signal on. People end up getting their cars impounded, paying $500, $600, $700 in court costs, fees, and citations, and they end up once they miss a payment, they end up in this cycle where they end up essentially doing time because they don't have enough money.
Yeah.
And it's a really vicious cycle, because once you start to fall through that crack, it's so hard to pull yourself back up again. And I just want to add, there's something really peculiar that Milton, West Virginia does on top of this. They put, like you said, when you put someone in jail, they're still innocent until proven guilty. They're waiting for their day in
Right.
court. They will post the mugshots of people on Facebook page. So imagine, on the internet, things live there forever.
Yeah.
So you're essentially people in the town and from around the country make comments on this Facebook page, making fun of people, accusing them of being drug addicts, or accusing them of domestic violence, or accusing them of any wild thing. And this person might later be proven completely innocent.
Right.
But now they have this on their record in a double way. The rest of the world knows, the entire internet knows this, and it affects their family life, their romantic life, their professional life. So there are these other levels that are put on top of it that really surprised me, that this small town policing, it has levels of damage that surprised me. When I think of police brutality as a problem, or police misconduct as a problem, I think of cities. I think of cities like my home, Baltimore City. But these small towns find other ways of punishing their residents that are really quite cruel.
One thing that was really interesting, we uncovered Milton. We encountered Milton because of a young man who was arrested for having some hemp plants in his trailer, but he had $100,000 bail. And when we started reporting on it, then they lowered the bail $80,000. $100,000 bail, of course, is huge. But the interesting about it was the cash bail that was payable to the court. Right, so when he finally got out, he had to pay $3,000 to the court. There wasn't a bail bondsman. So the city and the county were collecting the fees, which I thought was very interesting. We're still looking into it, but the point being that at every point, by having these centers being able to incarcerate people, set bail, and then having to pay it to the court, you have a system where, they're actually monetizing every aspect of this, monetizing the arrest, monetizing the incarceration, monetizing the bail. And of course, as bail means that rich people get due process and poor people do not.
Exactly.
And it's astonishing to me that in these very, very poor communities where, like in Milton, for example, the median household income is $22,000,
Right.
which is $40,000 less than the U.S. median income, that they have these astonishing bail restrictions. I mean, as you know, cash bail is one of the most punitive
Yeah.
things ever because
Yes.
you can't use a bail bondsman.
Yeah.
And we encounter this a lot, that these little, you have a judge who has all the power in the county, and, it's very easy to monetize your population.
And you know what? When I was looking at the Vera report, and I can't get around this in my head, because in order to maintain, this is where it's nefarious. In order to maintain this, you're not talking about in the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration overall. When a person is convicted of a crime, most people won't be in prison for 20 years. You can say, okay, 20 years, we're gonna have a population of 2,100. And in 20 years, it's gonna be a 2,100 population in
That's
some
a good
part of the
point.
country. But we talking about a county, and we talking about a small county, and we talking about them building institutions that they have to create. They had to create the conditions in
Yes.
order to fill it.
Yes.
That's the point.
That's a really
it's
good point.
being overlooked.
And-
It's being overlooked. Is that? Can y'all
Yeah,
talk
well,
about
well,
that?
think about it. What you say is to me astonishing because it's something I think about a lot. They're inevitably saying that a certain number of people are going to end up in jail and going to commit crimes. It's like they're
Right.
anticipating failure in the community, right?
Right.
They're literally saying we are planning for 20% of our population to
Exactly.
fail and to be in a cage. That I think as Americans, we look at things and we say, what happens in this country? That, but think about that. How many communities are planning for people to end up in a cage? That is astonishing to me. That would be something that they would look at and hire consultants and do the numbers and wow, well we're going to be able to fill this. Actually, we'll probably have 2,500 people in there.
Right, exactly.
And what the hell is that
Yeah,
as a
exactly.
public policy, right?
And that's the point that the bill. That's what you're saying, policy and practice.
Right.
And Ted, you may want to beat up on this point a little bit, because when you're saying policy and practice, and it's premeditated.
Yes.
I'm saying that, going back to your point, I'm saying that I build a jail that can hold 4,500 people in this county. Now I only have a county of the population doesn't exceed that. So where are these people gonna come from? But more importantly, the policies, the laws have changed. That means that everybody is weighing in on this, on the state and local level, in order to have this creation.
I think it's important, once again, to emphasize how this shows the lie that these corrections institutions are built for rehabilitation, to help people. These institutions are built mostly for profit. And I think that's proven out by the need to put bodies in these beds. And it's been shown that, like the CCA, the Corrections Corporation of America, and Core Civic now, I believe, that these private institutions have engaged in some really nefarious practices to make sure that they keep on getting bodies into these beds. And I think, like Stephen said, planning for a community to fail, it's also planning for your police department to fail. I thought they're supposed to be out there preventing crimes.
Yeah, right.
It says they're planning for their social programs to fail. I thought we're supposed to be making our community flourish. I thought our schools are supposed to be helping kids get good jobs.
Yeah.
Why are we planning for 20% of our population to be incarcerated?
It's extraordinary.
There's a profit motive.
And the thing is, like, if you look at a town like Milton, it's a microcosm of this problem.
Right, exactly.
And what struck me about it was when I was going through the town, budget, there wasn't a single dollar dedicated to drug addiction treatment or any social services for the people. So to your point, they're saying, if you get addicted which is a disease,
Right,
Yes.
exactly.
the solution we have is handcuffs, right? And that to me, there's no way, it speaks what you're saying. They're basically creating public policy that says, we're gonna fill this. That's our public policy, not public policy saying, you know what, let's take half that money and put it into drug interdiction or drug treatment. And what's extraordinary about it, as you point about who is a criminal, who's not, we were having this conversation, what behavior is criminalized, like
Right.
petty theft. Well, the state of West Virginia, Huntington, I think it was Huntington, or it would have been Cabell County, just lost a lawsuit suing these pharmaceutical companies that knowingly dumped.
Right.
They were the biggest drug dealers the world has
Right,
ever
right,
seen,
right.
and not a single person has gone to jail. But you know, you use a little dope on the corner of Milton, there'll be 5 cops putting you in jail for
Yes.
3 years. But
Right.
you go out and you dump 100 million pills in a county of 90,000 people,
Yeah.
you can walk away with a nice boat in the Bahamas.
And I remember when I looking at that whole pharmaceutical situation. I remember reading one report where because of them little counties, they don't regulate the pharmacies, and so basically the pharmacies become like drug dealers on the corner. But
They wish there's a drug dealer that wishes they could work like those guys could work. You know, the amount of money they were making, they would make drug dealers jealous,
Yeah.
and they were doing it all legally, and no one's gone to jail.
And but I think that when we look at this whole River report, and when we look at the reality behind it, the reality is that one, like you said earlier, the prison industrial complex, they're making this argument that the population is shrinking, but on the back end, private corporations, because remember I recall private corporations was in the major prison institutions, but because of being heavily regulated and Eighth Amendment violations, a whole lot of laws that came out around prisoners' rights, they were able to maintain and sustain holding down these prisons. So they had to get out of that space. But what they have done there, they found their niche in local counties, and and I'm going to emphasize points premeditated because only for you to have people we're talking about pretrial detention. The average person when I was locked up, I had a felony, so I was on the felony section. The population of the county jail I was in was 1,600. Out of 1,600, 600 of us had major felonies. So we wasn't gonna get no bail regardless. Right. The remaining population had truancy, spouse, domestic, not to diminish domestic, shoplifting, broken vagabond. These are the major people that you find in the county jail. At least that up until this point. Now, you might find them people in these county jails, but then they go into the bail, and they might give them an astronomical bail. I'm a vagrant. Oh, because I can't give you an address of where I live at. You have to keep me there. So you keep me. So you, as a sheriff department or as a county, you say, okay, it's almost like a ledger. Okay, well we gonna have Hopkins here for at least 2 years because he ain't gonna make bail. So that's a body we're gonna have for 2 years, and start adding up bodies. How long in order for to maintain? Because you can only maintain it if you got bodies.
Right.
If you don't have bodies, then it's gonna be a ghost town. Which goes to the other point. Maybe y'all can weigh in on this here. Talk about how these county jails are being used to create an infrastructure for rural America.
Do you want me to? Well, I can say that, as we talked about before, and you look at, West Virginia is chronically absent of drug treatment centers. They're constantly behind, but they're not behind in prison building. And, to me, it's extraordinary to think that after undergoing this incredible crime, this is nothing less than a crime, that pharmaceutical greed led to the deaths and addiction of thousands of poor West Virginia people. But all the money, if you look at the towns, like I said before, it's not only going to policing, but building prisons, building local prisons, local jails, places where, like Taya talked about, coal country. The Vera Institute report emphasizes, I think, Western Kentucky. Is it Eastern Western? I think it's Eastern. And, that's an area that's been hit hard by, the lack of coal mining. And what did they build? Did they build universities? Did they build, I can think of a million other things. Parks? I don't know, something. Did they build job training? No, they built prisons. And, it's reflexive because I think it goes back to our country's addiction to slave labor and these things. And our country's never really gotten over that idea of an extractive economy. And the perfect tool for an extractive economy is a jail.
Right.
Because as you point out, a vagabond, a person who doesn't conform to the capitalist expectation that we're all working all the time, can just be put in jail. And if you don't want to work for nothing and you don't want to kill yourself, we're going to put you in jail.
Right.
You can stay in jail, and then we'll monetize you that way. Now, it's not what these communities find, and I think this is what's really tragic. It doesn't work. It doesn't build a better community.
Right.
It doesn't even bring safety. It's a constant, sort of monetization and problematizing its population, but doesn't build a stronger community. And that's what's insane about it. Because you see this, that this policy hasn't led to anything productive. I mean, Milton is a mess.
Right,
and the people there are
exactly.
very unhappy.
Right.
And why? Because they're not addressing the needs of their citizens, and then people lose faith in democracy. So it's really like an anti-democratic strain that goes throughout our system, is this addiction to criminal justice because we have an extractive economy.
Absolutely. Well, Stephen, I think you made a really good point that it leads to a lack of community trust and kind of honestly like an undermining of people's faith in our democratic institutions. When you were talking, I couldn't help but think of Greensboro, Maryland, down on the Eastern Shore here, and the death of a young Anton Black back in September of 2018. And there was a change in the police chief, and the new mayor said, I want aggressive policing in this community, a community of less than 2,300 people.
Right.
One stoplight.
One stoplight, no murders. I don't know why they needed this aggressive policing, but that's what the mayor wanted. That's what the new chief was going to give them. And they brought down from Denton, Delaware, an officer named Thomas Webster, who had multiple complaints against him, who had been caught on camera kicking in the head a completely compliant suspect who was obeying all orders. And the community said, hey, we know the name of the officer you're about to bring down. Please don't bring him here. He's not the right type of person for our community. Please don't do this. They ignored the community. A year later, that same officer was involved. He initiated the conflict that led to the tasering, the choking, and honestly, the murder of this young man on his mother's doorstep because they would not listen to the community. And so how can the community have any sort of faith in the people who are supposed to protect them and take care of them and serve them? How are they supposed to have any faith in their government officials when they cried out, please don't let this officer come to our community? How are they supposed to have any sort of faith in government, in our police officers when they do this? And this young man's murdered, a beautiful 19-year-old man who never got to see his daughter born.
And y'all have the last word on this, but I want to say something in regard to the premeditation of this particular these policies and these procedures, because right now, as it stands right now, going back to like you say, when it's no harm in the community, you create these prisons, you build, they become, or you build them and you supply jobs for a percentage of the population, and that become my livelihood. So now my livelihood is, when I come out of high school, where you gonna work at? I'm gonna work in the county jail.
Right.
My livelihood, where you gonna work? What you gonna be when you come out of there? I'm gonna be a probation officer. What you gonna be when you come out? I'm gonna be a cook in the kitchen in the county jail.
Right.
But at any rate, this is where the infrastructure and the institutions provide the livelihood for the community.
Yeah.
But then when you can't maintain that population, and you talk about closing it down, then the community start bemoaning. We were just doing this interview yesterday when it was in California. The town of Susanville sued and for held it for 2 years, pleading and begging and trying to get the court to say don't close the prison.
Right.
But y'all got the last word on this report, and what do y'all think should happen?
Well, it's a classic case of a political economy, and I think that we need to be, radical about this and defund prison industrial complex.
Yes.
I mean, people. It's really. I think one of the things that Taya and I talk about a lot is how the missed opportunity of talking about police funding. Because if you look at Baltimore City, we put most of our resources in policing and criminal justice, and what do we have? We have the same problems we had 30 years ago. It's not that people don't want to pay a cop or I don't know, build a prison, but as you point out, the thought behind putting all your resources in there is that you're going to create a world where those conditions will lead to filling it. And so when you're saying defund, what you're really saying is reorient the resources of a community towards something that will be a productive outcome for happier people, right? I don't know why we never think of that philosophy. And I think that one of the things that's most pernicious about law enforcement in this country is it's a philosophy that integrates into our minds and makes us think there's no other possibilities. We need to explore the possibilities of a world without mass incarceration.
Right.
We need to start thinking about it. And the way to start thinking about it is saying, maybe we should build a park
Yeah,
you
exactly,
know,
yeah.
or maybe we should build a better school, or pay teachers what they deserve to be paid, rather than, as you point out, create a political economy where everyone's work is oriented towards caging people. It's extraordinary how much money this country spends on it. What, $80 billion a
$80
year?
billion.
$80 billion. Yeah, imagine what you could do with $80 billion.
Yeah,
Incredible.
So I think it's a matter of deconstructing the political economy, which just means doing exactly what you say, creating something where people don't think about being a corrections officer, but rather think about being a teacher, or don't think about being a chef, but at the prison, but think about opening a restaurant.
Open a restaurant,
right?
yeah,
You know,
right.
I mean, and that takes a philosophical confrontation with the real underlying reasons of why our criminal justice predominates and why it holds our imagination. And I'm sorry, and it really stultifies our ability to solve problems.
You know, I would just have to say one thing I've seen that's happened in these small towns is that people who are initially excited to be able to get a job with law enforcement, get a job as a corrections officer, eventually these systems turn around and eat the community itself. And they end up weaponized against the community. And that's what like the people in Milton are seeing. You know, I've spoken to people who were former corrections officers in small towns or even former police officers. And they've seen that these organizations have been weaponized against them and are actually tearing at the fabric of their community.
Right.
So all that money that's being invested to give people employment in corrections and in policing, if we could put that money elsewhere into, you know, mental health services, training people for different types of institutions for job training, education, social services, mental health services. There are a lot of drug services to help people who are dealing with substance abuse issues. There are so many places, so many ways we could employ people that aren't corrections that could also help prevent the conditions that send people into the correctional institutions. You can have people be gainfully and happily employed without them being a part of an institution that eventually tears their community apart. So there's a way to do it, but that underlying philosophy is something that is propaganda that's been fed to a lot of Americans. There are a lot of Americans who've been watching Law and Order and they think it's all real. And so that propaganda around policing and they always get the right person, it's going to take a lot to kind of get that out of people's system, to get that out of the American bloodstream. But we need to work on it.
The one thing we've seen clearly is that policing is one of the most anti-democratic institutions ever conceptualized.
Amen that.
Yeah, and you know, we've been sold this bill of goods that it's actually like the protector of democracy, the exact opposite. In every city where policing predominates, people's rights have been eroded. You know, and people's quality of life has been eroded. That's just my experience as a reporter, not my ideological opinion. So we need to rethink and reimagine how a community can be built.
There you have it. The real news about the prison industrial complex, mass incarceration. Oh, did we know that now we're talking about them having an incubator in society where county jails are they're going to supersede prison industrial complex in and of themselves. These small counties in rural America are bidding on having county jails building jails in their town in order to provide jobs and services for the community, and then later on turn on the community, because you build them, you have to fill them. It's not build them, they're going to come. You build them, you have to fill them. Thank you, Taya. Thank you, Steve.
No, it's cool.
For this
Thanks for
enlightening
having us.
conversation. I really enjoyed it. And
too.
hopefully, Rattling the Bars viewers and Real News viewers, you'll continue to support us as we bring this news to you. This is the real news. It's not the alternative news. It's different between the real news and the alternative news. It's really the news and not an alternative to some news. Thank y'all very much for coming.
Thanks
Thank you so much for having us.
You having us.